Hey, it's Mike here. If you were ever to see my car, you would know I am not exactly Mr. Punctual about things like maintenance. I will forget about an oil change until that blinking light reminds me. So I guess Car Care to Go is designed for folks like me, and I suspect it's designed for a lot of the folks who listen to our show too. You make an appointment, they show up, pick up your ride, and bring it back a few hours later with the oil changed, the wipers replaced, and the seats tidied. They are accessible all over DC. Instead of sitting in a waiting room drinking bad coffee, why not sit at home and drink your own coffee while they do the work? Get your first synthetic oil change for just $20.23. Get it? That's 2023 with the code FIRST20. No catch. Any make or model. Sign up at carcaretogo.com.
Want to hang out with the CityCast DC team IRL? Then come to our live taping, Saturday, June 3rd. Taping starts at 1. It'll be at Right Proper Brewery in Brookland, where we'll be chatting with the head of the DC Brewers Guild about DC's craft brew scene. So come out, drink, chat, meet the team, and learn all about DC's local brews. Today on CityCast DC, WAMU's food culture podcast Dish City is nominated for yet another James Beard Award this year. It's a huge accomplishment, and in celebration, we're rerunning this conversation all about all things DC food with the show's creators Ruth Tam and Patrick Fort. Whether it's Old Bay on crabs, the history of DC's Chinatown, or half smokes and pupusas, we've got you covered. It's Wednesday, May 31st. I'm Bridget Todd, and here's what DC is talking about. I am so excited to talk to you two today. I just got finished listening to your brunch episode, and so I'm ready and raring to go and to talk about all of your food DC opinions. So much of the work that y'all do on the show is really about chronicling, these foods that are unique to DC. Are there foods that you would think would be the most unique or the most special or the most closely held for the most people in DC?
The one that I think of for this is definitely mumbo sauce. I was trying to figure out what food stands out to me, and I think that it's mumbo sauce because I don't know if you remember this in 2018 when Muriel Bowser said that mumbo sauce was annoying, and it was this whole thing, and everyone was so mad about it. And just a few weeks ago, I was walking down the street. It was right before the primary election, and I saw just this clandestine poster that had a picture of Mayor Bowser, and it said, Mumbo Muriel, hating on the sauce, hating on families, hating on DC.
All right, I dare to ask, is anybody else annoyed by mumbo sauce?
Well, that's the question DC Mayor Muriel Bowser asked on Facebook last night. And a lot of you responded. Hundreds of people slammed the mayor for saying this unique sauce is not essential to DC culture.
And I think that, if people can take this kind of offhand comment about food, but it's a campaign issue 4 years later, I think that's a good indication that you've got a food that is pretty important to a lot of people.
Absolutely. And as soon as she said that, I remember thinking people in DC are not going to forget this. And there just happens to be that alliteration, Mumbo Muriel. I saw a poster that called her Mumbo Muriel. I mean, it just goes to show people in DC have, one, pretty long memories, and two, very particular food opinions.
I will say, personally speaking, Salvadoran food is something that I started eating right when I first got to DC, but was something that I had never had prior to coming to DC. And it's something that, I just had last night. It's something that I've consistently eaten throughout my time here. And pupusas were my gateway into local DC food culture. The year that I moved to DC, I'm pretty sure it was the year it was announced that DC was Bon Appetit's big food city, or it was one of the early years of my time here. And so that was happening on one track of my brain, and on the other track of my brain, I was just where are the pupusas? I just want a pupusa. And that was the neighborhood food that I would get, and it's the food that I crave. And so for me, Salvadoran food, Salvamex restaurants, that really says DC to me.
Do you do your pupusas with the cabbage on top?
Oh, yeah. I have to have the pupusas with the cortido, which is the cabbage slaw. It's just the perfect mix of you have your fatty, cheesy goodness from inside the pupusa itself. You may have other fillings like meats or whatever. Yesterday I got mine with zucchini because I, wanted to be healthy or whatever. You're still eating it in like a cheesy fried pocket. I don't really know what I was thinking. But yeah, the curtido is like this like sour, crunchy, sweet topping for it. And it's just perfect with the pupusa.
Oh, you're making me hungry. I'm curious, as y'all have been researching food in the city for so long, what kind of trends have you noticed in making the show?
I think one thing that's interesting and that we maybe are sensitive to as the people who make the show is that so many of the narratives that we explore for different foods in different episodes repeat themselves. Like history repeats itself. One of the prime examples of something that we covered in our show is what happened in 1968 with the uprising after Martin Luther King Jr. died and what turned into what many know as the riots on, U Street, 14th Street in downtown DC. We covered that in our Half Smokes episode, our first episode ever. And then in 2020, we were working on our second season and we were kind of covering how people were responding to the pandemic and all of that, but then the George Floyd protests and the Black Lives Matter protests kind of just like engulfed DC, and the same conversations that people were having regarding whether or not businesses should be supportive of protests that could turn violent, or whether or not you could support Black Lives Matter and also support Black restaurants and Black neighborhoods. The choices that people were trying to set out, like, it has to be one or the other and mutually exclusive. Like, that conversation was happening in 1968. It happened in 2020. And these are things that, repeat themselves. And that's something that was specific to these two episodes that we did, both in 2019 and 2020. But there are other themes that pop up, too. We talk a lot about gentrification and city change. We talk a lot about how immigrant groups move into certain neighborhoods and, maybe are forced to, maybe because they're not welcome in other neighborhoods and they're pushed out of certain places and they wind up in parts of town that ultimately become very valuable both for other businesses and for the city itself. And so you see episodes that we've talked about, the Chinese immigrant population making a Chinatown along H Street in DC, or the Vietnamese population in Clarendon or Northern Virginia. These are communities that built up those spaces into community centers and then were ultimately pushed out for other types of businesses, something that the city not just allowed, but encouraged and wanted to happen. So these are themes that just kind of continually occur. And so whether it's like the supposed forced choice between supporting Black lives versus Black businesses, or, immigrant groups coming in and making a place lively and then being forced to move, these are things that just continually happen.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm wondering, how do you see the changing food culture? Do you see it mimicking the way that the city's demographics have changed?
I don't know if I would call it different groups of people, but it's different lenses, really. I mean, I think a lot of the top line food that we're covering, whether we're doing an episode about Half Smokes or we do an episode about Chinatown or something like that it's very kind of foundational understanding of a food, and then it's pretty removed from the buzzy restaurant blog sort of thing. It's not to say that there isn't a place for that. And I guess I would say that the people who are interested in a socioeconomical review of Half Smokes are sometimes the people who are interested in the latest restaurant opening, but not always.
Hey CityCast DC, it's Mark Kolkowski. While CityCast DC works hard every day to connect you with the stories that matter most, I'm working in the background making sure that our listeners are connecting with the best the DMV has to offer. So what does that look like? It means meeting with the people who make the district what it is, the business owners, the stakeholders, the decision makers, the Washingtonians who put together those food festivals you enjoy, the concerts you attend, the exhibits you can't miss, and who make those candles your mom can't stop talking about. So if this sounds like you, let me help you get your message out to the best audience in town with an ad right here on the CityCast DC podcast and on our sister daily newsletter, Hey DC. Send me an email at ads@citycast.fm and let's connect.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about the podcast. So I know that season 1 was about DC proper. Season 2 and 3 took us through the pandemic. And then season 4, you were really talking about like the burbs, what's happening outside of the district proper. If someone was a new listener and they wanted to figure out where to get started, where would you recommend they start? Like, is there a Dish City starter pack that folks should really start their journey with the show through?
I have 3. The list keeps growing. From our most recent season, I really like the episode we did about crabs and all of the labor that goes into catching them and selling them and eating them. From our 3rd season, I like our episode about delivery food and the labor that goes into it. Realizing that there's a trend there as I say this. And then I also really like our episode about mumbo sauce from our 1st season.
For me, the Chinatown episode was my attempt at answering a question that I've had in DC, like ever since I've been a resident for the last 9+ years. I, remember feeling like, oh, this is my first time living in a city where I have close access to a Chinatown. When I grew up in the suburbs outside of Chicago, Chinatown was, a 45-minute drive away. When I was in school around Boston, Chinatown felt a little further because I was kind of mostly on campus, even though I did go. And then when I moved to DC, I was like, oh, I am a district resident now. Like, DC has a Chinatown. It's right there. It's accessible to me. After repeat visits, I was like, okay, I don't think this is the Chinatown that I'm familiar with. And I was always kind of wondering, why are there all these Chinese signs that kind of make it seem like this place is more Chinese than it really is? And it kind of just sat with me in a weird way. And when I found places outside of the city, like when I started going to Eden Center, when I started going to Rockville, I was not really asking that question as much anymore because I had found my version of Chinatown. It just existed outside of DC. But the question never really went away. So when we decided to launch this season, I did want to have an episode about why, so much of the good Chinese food that you can find here is outside of the city. And you cannot answer that question without explaining what happened to the people who used to live in DC's Chinatown, not just on 8th Street, but along Pennsylvania Ave. The DC's original Chinese population lived there. And, I was like, I don't know how we're going to do this episode. This spans 100 years. And we decided to focus on what happened in DC as opposed to, what's going on in the suburbs right now. But yeah, that's kind of where it came from. And it was hard for me because this is a community that even though I'm not an immigrant and I didn't grow up in DC, I still feel like, oh, I'm still part of DC's Chinese community, even if I don't live in Chinatown. And I felt a lot of weight, honestly, in terms of reporting on that community. I didn't know if I could do it well. I didn't know if I could do it enough of it in the time that we had. There were a lot of challenges, but I felt like it was really important, and people only really talk about the losses, but people don't talk about what was here before. They're just like, oh, there's no Chinese people here. And that's kind of where the conversation ends when people talk about Chinatown. And I wanted to go further than that.
Yeah, I guess I'd wonder, how often do you two find yourselves trying to answer some specific question about food or a style of food, and then you end up telling this, very thoughtful, nuanced, painting a portrait of communities or of a history or of you think you're setting out to answer just a small question and it ends up being so much more. Is that something that happens a lot when you're doing the show?
I would like to think that we're trying to answer big questions. I feel like a lot of the topics that we choose to write about I hope people think that they're significant or important and that they aren't easy to answer and a really final or clean way. I hope that we tell those stories in ways that people think are illustrative or are informative to people.
I think though it does happen quite often. We do research before the episodes, and so it's not as if so many of the conclusions are complete surprises to us, but there are genuinely episodes for which we didn't know how the story would pan out, or we didn't realize it would go that way. I think 2 examples from our last season are our Old Bay episode and our Vietnamese food episode. We definitely knew we wanted to do an episode on Old Bay just because people are obsessed with it. It's obviously it's just too big to ignore. So we have to do an episode on Old Bay, of course. But we did not actually know the origins of Old Bay, nor did we know that most crab houses in the state of Maryland don't actually use Old Bay on their crabs. And so that was like a very like, whoa, this is
Wait,
something that we
what?
learned on the job. Well, if this is surprising to you,
Do we have a podcast for you?
This is shocking information.
many local crab houses don't actually use Old Bay. You know, many of them use JO number 2, which is a similar spice blend but with coarser salts so that it adheres to crabs better when it steams. And Old Bay is like a finer spice blend, and so it can kind of melt off crabs if it doesn't have those like crystals of salt. And this is something we didn't know when we started the episode. We just thought we were going to do an episode on Old Bay fandom because it's so intense. But we had all this history and all this like kind of industry specific information that we did not realize until we did the reporting. And so all this learning that's happening is happening in real time. And similarly, in the Vietnamese food episode, I just thought I was going to do an episode on the importance of Eden Center because it's something that means something personally to me. It means something personally to a lot of people in Northern Virginia and elsewhere. But we did not realize that the Vietnamese community that grew Eden Center started in Clarendon. And we don't associate Clarendon with Vietnamese food. We associate Clarendon with brunch or just like retail, like the metro. Like this doesn't have a lot of like, let's say, international flavor. And so to learn that the Vietnamese community of this region started there was something that I did not know, and we learned on the job.
Wow, that is very surprising. I didn't know any of that. And I bet this kind of work probably brings up all kinds of like surprise little histories and cultures that you would never know. Patrick, I'm curious if you have a food story that particularly surprised you.
I mean, in journalism, surprise people, there's lots of stuff that aren't in the stories that you end up reading or listening to or whatever. And when we were reporting our Half Smokes episode, years and years and years ago, we are at this like meat processing facility and a person was like, oh, and here are these rows and rows of cured hams. And we were like, what would you possibly use a cured ham for? And he's like, oh, it's this thing, Southern Maryland stuffed ham. Maybe you should make an episode about it. And, it was funny, haha. And we like learned about this new thing. And we ended up doing a whole episode about it at this person's recommendation. People mention things offhand all the time and they end up being very interesting. And I learned about a whole new place and a whole new cuisine.
Well, Ruth and Patrick, thank you so much for being here. This episode was really enlightening and I feel like it made me hungry, but also made me curious to find out more about eating through DC.
Thanks for talking to us. It was really fun.
Thanks for having us.
And before you go, I have a favor to ask. CityCast is surveying our listeners, that is, you, to learn more about you. Their survey will help us make CityCast DC a better, more useful podcast. Please take the survey at citycast.fm/survey. It only takes 5 minutes. That's citycast.fm/survey. Plus, survey takers will also be eligible to win a $250 Visa gift card. That's citycast.fm/survey. Okay, here's some quick news. The Purple Line is not new to delays, trouble, and change. And the trend continues with the announcement that both the executive director and communications director are off the project. The 16-mile light rail from Bethesda to New Carrollton is already 4.5 years behind schedule. The Maryland Transit Administration has said it will promptly begin searching for a new executive director for transit development and delivery. Also, a group of Montgomery County residents is pushing the local council to ban short-term amenity rentals, particularly pools. The debate centers on the app Swimply, which allows homeowners to rent out private pools. Some residents say the rentals bring loud, rowdy pool parties to their neighborhood. The county is already considering adding regulations and taxes to home amenity rentals, but the growing backlash could mean the app's removal entirely. Finally, a boil water advisory has been in place for several Northeast neighborhoods since Sunday. The concern came when a water main broke, causing a loss in water pressure. Once there have been 2 consecutive days of clear samples, DC Water will lift the boil water order. That's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell your favorite DC foodie? We'll be back tomorrow morning with even more news from around the city. Talk to you then. water will lift the boil water, or that's a very difficult thing to say. It's like a tongue twister.